let's go back to the beginning, because to track how this all occurred, we have to start from the beginning, because you'll start to see that this seeking love, this sex drive, it starts at the time, let's call it, of birth. And it's not like we're born as sexual beings like that. I don't mean that. It's if you think about it, we're in our mother's womb, and for whatever we're in there, 9 months, it's pure bliss, at least bliss enough that everything, all needs are met in utero. So it's the closest experience in a physical body, if you will, where we are one, where a heaven experience, right? Now, someone can make an argument that we're still taking on downloads from our mother. So her thoughts, her wounds, her patterns, because for 9 months, we're part of her. So really, in India, they would say that at the moment of conception, the stamp happens, and every moment of consciousness is being recorded. So our mom's state of being, her worries, her anxieties, her unresolved sexual traumas and wounds and intimacy issues, maybe of the man, maybe she still has unhealed wounds with the man, maybe the man's not providing or around, maybe they are, maybe they're fighting. All of that stuff starts to get recorded right from the moment. We're still, though, connected and all needs met. And then suddenly we're born. And there was a teaching from a book called Intimate Relationships, Why They Do and Do Not Work by Stephen Walensky, who followed the same path of teachers in India that I studied. So my teacher was a translator for Walensky's teacher. That's how I found his books. And I read a bunch of his books, Trance as People Live, and we could cite these books. The Intimate Relationships, Why They Do and Do Not Work. I think it was called False Core, False Self. He had suggested in there that the shock of separation from our mom is so great that we spend that from the moment of birth to that first year, that we spend our whole life trying to heal it. So we go from perfection in utero to cold, what happens, like cold, bright lights, which trigger the amygdala in itself. We get spanked on our butt, we're crying, and this is like our welcome to the world. And it's so shocking. And we long, and we don't have mother like that. It's a different relationship now. So the theory from that is that we put up masks, false core, false self masks. And in relationships, we don't really meet when we first meet someone. And I also studied around arousal, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the book, what arousal and how it affects intimacy. But that's later in the journey, because at this point, we cry. There's going to be a moment mom or dad doesn't come. Like they're very early on. There's going to be a moment when I have a need and it's not met. And if I go from a space of all my needs are met to now I'm crying and I have a need and it's not met, that itself is so shocking to the child, the individual, the human, that we put on these masks. So when relationships, we meet at our masks. Now, the way the masks develop is from our parents very often. They're the strongest, because mommy and daddy in the beginning are really like God. If you think about it, they are everything. Now, I know some people have trauma early on where maybe very early on, mom and dad lost that mystique. Others, maybe it's later in their life, teenage years. But in that moment, they're constantly downloading and learning about intimacy. They're learning about connection. The child is learning about how to navigate in the world of relationships. And very early on, our parents shape their unresolved traumas and guilt and shame around sex, where they've used it for manipulation. where they've maybe broken their own principles around sex, where they've maybe done things that they would be ashamed if people knew, and maybe they weren't like that. Maybe they suppressed their sexuality. All of that is going to impact the child. And it's not just how, in a sexual way, it's how mommy loved daddy, or was daddy loved mommy? Was dad even around? Was mom even around? All of that stuff. So early on, little boys, and I understand there's a lot of talk about different genders and all that stuff, and we just keep it really basic for this conversation. For the most part, the norm is that little boys are taught to objectify. Little girls are taught to be objects of affection. That's the way the game's set up. I mean, I can remember at 2, 3 years old trying to kiss girls. Like, where did I learn that? How did I learn? Like, did I just come at it? Like, even I had learned and heard that, you can look at family dynamics. You can look at, we call it a drift, like the water we swim in, cultural drifts. It's like the collective unconsciousness that, having Middle Eastern, part Italian, mainly, that is a certain, you're talking about thousands of years of men being a certain way and certain passed down generation to generation, objectifying. This is the way. So it sets up this really insane dance around sex and love that when you step out of it, you see that almost all of the world is under the spell. And the parents, now I want to say something about parents. And as we go further in the book, it's going to get illustrated more. But I was told this by one of the people in the acknowledgments of the book, who definitely deserves one of the highest acknowledgments for the book, because without him, I wouldn't have learned this. He said to me, and I added to it, he said, when you're in bed with your wife, there's not just 2 of you there. There's really 4 of you there. I went to add to there's really 6 of you there. He was really saying, like, because there's you and your wife, and then there's both your parents. And you need to get your parents out of the bedroom. Now, what does that mean? Well, you're going to start to realize that what most people bring into the relationship, they learned about intimacy or didn't learn about intimacy from their parents. Like, as a man, your first 18 years, your intimate relationship is with a mother. Like, that's who nagged you. That's who complimented you. That's who critiqued you. That's your intimate relationship. So if you don't realize that you're operating under that operating system, and you bring that now as a 40-year-old man into a marriage, that marriage in some ways most likely won't stand a chance. Because here's what's going to happen from our parents is, and we'll illustrate this really clearly throughout the book, is that since you're a man, I'm a man, I learned most of my intimacy and we both from mother, right? That's how most, and not to say that some people don't have a distorted relationship with their mother. There could be all kinds of trauma, but for the most part, we learn intimacy from mom, and the girls learn it from dad, right? In terms of an intimate relationship with someone of the opposite sex. The difficulty, what ends up happening from a psychological perspective, is if that's not worked through. Now I'm 30 and I get into a relationship with someone that it's really hot, heavy, and there's so much attraction. But let's say maybe we fall in love. Well, they already know the first 2 years of a relationship, it's like you're on drugs, or like your brain is on cocaine to some degree. When that wears off, we were talking about like the honeymoon phase is over. Oh, she's my ball and chain. Well, where did we learn that? We learned that from watching our parents, right? So if our parents are in the bedroom, what that means is not like from a sexually, not like we learned all of that. Now, what ends up happening is, and you see this playing out in relationships throughout the world, men end up maternalizing their wife. So what does that mean? Well, if we're dating and then the honeymoon phase is over, and let's say we get married, we move in, we have kids. Now I see you as a mother. You're the mother of my children. Or let's say we're really deep intimate, we're living together, and we have a family and all this stuff, maybe even our immediate family, we're just in relationship over time. When the honeymoon phase wears off, because men specifically in this scenario don't know how to be intimate, because they only learn intimacy from their mom, they'll end up starting to maternalize their wife. So what that looks like is like, she nags on me, and then the wife starts to criticize more, right? Because she has her relationship with her father, whatever it was, whether he was there, whether he's not, what she learned about intimacy, what she learned about her sexuality and how to use that for power, all of that from parents, not just parents, but the world. But let's say mainly the core relationship in the beginning is our parents. Now, you could look into Freud and, whether he was talking about the Oedipus complex, and then you're competing with your father for mother's love and all of that. So let's say that a lot of that stuff plays out in those dynamics. It then moves from mother into intimate relationships. So let's go back to the story we were telling, in that, let's say I'm 30 years old and I fall in love, and like 2-3 years goes past. Then we move in together. And then we move in together, the mystique is gone. Like, we go to the bathroom next to each other. You get sick next to each other. You fart, and it makes smell. I mean, there's all that stuff happens. And see, that may start to see what ends up happening is men will start to get turned off. They don't realize they're getting turned off because they're going, wait, I'm not aroused in the same way. I love you, but I get more turned on by that hot young woman that I don't know anything about. Well, what they're doing subconsciously is they're maternalizing their wife. So when we going back to the analogy, when you're in bed with your wife, you have to get both your parents out of the room. Because if I'm maternalizing, you can't be sexually attracted for a long period of time to your wife if you start maternalizing. And that's when men end up going to porn. They just start innocently, like, I'm just going to fantasize. But then what ends up happening is the dopamine hit from the fantasy. Then you go back to make love to your wife, and it's like, eh. And then you're like, well, I watch some porn. And then you're like, whoa. And then you go back to your wife, and you're just like, eh. And then you're like, well, my wife doesn't look like, my wife, if she doesn't put makeup on, doesn't look like any of that. Like, wait, I think I like that more. And then they don't start to realize. And then what ends up happening is the woman in her relationship with her father, and then she maybe feels that. And see, the woman, this is just, I'm a man, obviously, so this is from my perspective. I notice it in marriage, like, the women can feel that pull away. They feel it because if you're objectifying outside of the marriage, a younger, prettier piece of body meat is what we're really doing. First off, how is your wife or someone in a relationship with a 10, 15, 20 years even going to compete with that? Like, if that's the case, everybody's out of their prime by the time they're out of college. I mean, maybe a couple of years out, and you're already, by the time you hit 30, like, no one's in their prime physically. Like, yeah, and you see this playing out in the world today. Well, really what it is it's little boys and girls that first off could never truly get mommy and daddy's love to the way they needed it. Because none of us come in here with ever getting complete love from our mom or dad. We don't. Because at some point, you cried and they didn't come. At some point, maybe they were having a bad day. They just couldn't fulfill your needs, and you realized you were alone. We all went through it at some point. Now, here's the thing. If we haven't healed that part of ourselves, and we never got mommy and daddy's love the way that we needed to, we will now bring it into our relationship, which is that old saying, you end up marrying your mom or your dad, or the opposite. Like, they were so bad, you go the opposite way, but they're still impacting your decision. That's why the work starts with, how do I resolve the unhealed parts of myself that I picked up from my parents, the little boy or girl that could never get that love? And then intimacy, right? Like, people who struggle with sex compulsions, almost all of them, none of them ever got to talk about intimacy from their dad or their parents. Like, let me tell you how to be intimate with someone and love them and be seen and connected, felt. And like nobody ever taught me that. All you saw was like objectify, conquer, and acquire. And all of that was passed down from generation to generation. And we have to go back to our parents first, see that. We don't have to do like, it doesn't have to be long therapy or anything like that. You go back and look at, you could write a letter to your parents, like resolving, clearing that. And now you could start to relate to your wife or your husband, like a present way, which means I'm not bringing my past from my parents into the bedroom. And what's magical is 10 years can go by. There's love, there's sex, there's no like longing or chasing after or objectifying. That's the end goal. We're gonna take step by step on how to get there and the things that we need to do to get to that. But if we start to see how it was put together, and the operating system was put together, we can now put it together, update it. Like we update our computer, we can update it to be the way that we want it to be so we can have a rich, fulfilling, intimate relationship, which is what we all really want.